Okay, so in the second part of this week's introductory lecture, I'm going to very briefly introduce you to the critical sociology of crime. So, the reading this week, in terms of introduction, we're talking about youth, crime, and gender. The reading this week focuses on youth and crime from the youth sociology textbook, which is just here, which is Julia, who's course coordinator, is one of the authors. So I think it has a really good synopsis of the things that I'm going to more focus upon here. It shows a kind of wider, it has wider descriptions of social theories, particularly some of the kind of more rationalistic and psychological theories about crime. What we're going to focus on here is some critical sociology understandings of crime and deviance. So, one thing to think about here in terms of the idea of deviance is deviance doesn't necessarily mean that it pertains to something, a practice that's illegal. Deviance is just kind of can range from breaking everyday norms to, committing crimes. And what's important to think about this from this kind of critical sociological perspective is that deviance is relative to time and place, and deviance also lies in the eye of the beholder. And I suppose that second one is going to be particularly important throughout the course. So relative to time and place, I mean, it was illegal for women to vote in the 1800s, and now it's not, right? So you can see there quite obviously that, something illegal once is not necessarily illegal all the time. Different things are legal in some countries as opposed to others, whether that's, the decriminalisation of cannabis, say, in New York or Canberra, as opposed to other parts of Australia at the moment. So things change over time, and they change in different places. Deviance also, in terms of lies by the beholder, is a kind of sociological way of thinking about deviance that, I suppose, moves aside notions of illegality and even morals in some respect, because, from a sociological perspective, particularly from a critical one, things like morals and laws tend to advantage particular groups of people. So we can think here about, for instance, how property laws really, favour those with property. We can think here about how the way the law is applied differently to different groups of people. The, professionals taking cocaine in their homes of a weekend at the dinner party is treated differently than some, young people, maybe smoking pot on the street or whatever. Same act in many ways, taking an illegal substance, but the way those things are regulated and treated by powerful institutions, and the way, if they're treated at all, is very different. So again, deviance and crime here need to be think of very contextually. So Becker is a prominent theorist in this area, Howard Becker, the kind of person that came up with labelling theory. And this quote here, I think, kind of sums up what I'm talking about. Deviance is not a quality of the act the person commits, but rather a consequence of the application by others of rules and sanctions to an offender. The deviant is one to whom the label has been successfully applied. Deviant behaviour is behaviour that people so label. So again here, the notion of deviance that we're going to use throughout this course isn't some kind of universal idea about good and bad or immoral and moral or whatever. We're going to think about how something is defined as deviant, how it comes to be socially constructed as deviant, and who benefits from those kind of social relations. So there's a whole myriad of sociological theories of deviance, from all kinds of different perspectives, and you can even kind of categorise them politically in many ways. The way we're going to look at it in this course is, again, critical sociological theories, and here we're acknowledging the influence of social and cultural factors to help understand and explain deviance and crime. This is particularly a way of kind of critically engaging the idea that say that, men are somehow naturally more violent, or evolutionary psychology understandings of gender and these kind of things. We're much more interested here in kind of how social inequalities and powerful structures and institutions create kind of strain between structural opportunities and cultural expectations. From this point of view, things that are seen as deviant and some criminal behaviour can then seen as a way of people in those disadvantaged positions kind of striving to achieve some of the things that are seen as, important things to achieve in society, even though they don't really have the means or access to the spaces that you can legitimately do that. So we can think of situational factors, structural opportunities, and cultural factors around, why people may commit deviant acts or crime. Things like peer group pressure in some groups, less access to opportunities such as employment and education, and the different kind of values and norms that apply to men and women, and different groups more generally. So importantly here, these kind of perspectives view deviant behaviour for individuals more about their kind of social positions, more about societal expectations, more about the way that laws and institutions reward and are for some people more than others, and how these kind of things relate to the kind of, I suppose, cultural goals and norms that we're all encouraged to kind of achieve from an early age. So we're thinking here about things like structural strain, opportunity, control. These kind of notions are important to think about how the kind of sometimes the cause of deviance lies outside of the individual. Now, importantly here, and obviously you could say to this is, rich people commit crimes and whatever. So this is like obviously not saying that crime was all done by one group and this is the reason why. This kind of more lots of different competing understandings of why this is the case. What we're interested in this course, I suppose, from a kind of youth studies perspective in particular, is particularly about disadvantaged young people, Indigenous young people, different ways that contours of inequality see them under the, I suppose, microscope and disciplinary technologies of powerful institutions, much more than more privileged and advantaged young people. So there's a concern here with, I suppose, the way that particular groups are targeted, and therefore they appear more in crime stats and stuff like that, even though they might necessarily be actually committing more crimes. So in terms of, solving issues of, say, of crime in society, here we're looking at more kind of broader structural explanations, reducing levels of social disorganisation, increasing education and employment opportunities, rather than, locking people up. So this is an important kind of distinction and specific way of thinking about crime that we'll be using throughout the course. So a key, and I think a quite elegant way of thinking about this is labelling theory. That comes from Howard Becker. And this is a way of thinking about how, throughout our lives and throughout even our day-to-day lives, most people break the rules. Most people have committed deviant acts and probably criminal acts in their lives. But really, not everyone gets in trouble for this. So the kind of everyday, breaking of rules or doing deviant acts is kind of seen as primary deviance. And these things tend to have little effect or consequences for us. But what happens, particularly if you're in an already marginalised and discriminated group, that if you do break the rules, you are much more likely to have the kind of attention paid to you by, police and teachers and counsellors and social workers and criminologists and sociologists. And this means that you're therefore much more open to being institutionalised, being arrested, being treated as a risk to society and having interventions into your life. So, relating to the quote before, this means that particularly people that break the rules tend to have a higher chance of being labelled as a deviant or as a criminal or as an offender. And once this is applied to young people, particularly at an early age, that stigma can become part of their own socialisation. They're increasingly treated as an outsider, as a problem, and this is then kind of enfolded into the way that they think about themselves and will often then kind of take on that role. If you're thinking back here to the work of Irving Goffman and dramaturgy and stuff like that in the 1010, this becomes a part of the performance of self of everyday life. So here we can see a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that may happen. Someone's identified as a deviant and then therefore take on that deviant identity and may then embark on a deviant career. So labelling theory shows that a young person, once it particularly comes to the attention of law enforcement and juvenile justice, once they're in that criminal justice system, that label can therefore have kind of quite negative effects on them. The labelling process in this sense may reinforce a person's identity as a delinquent or an offender or whatever, and then can maybe increase the chances of reoffending or continuing on down that path. This is particularly the case where we know that, entering Things like jails aren't really about, making the person better, but punishing them. And really, jails seem to be a good place to learn to do more crime in the future. So labelling theories are kind of, again, I hope, in the background of your mind when we're looking at many of the other kind of social problems that we look at throughout the course and the interventions into young people's lives. When it comes to relating this to youth and youth transitions and, that kind of liminal period between being a child and an adult, in that period, it's when we kind of push boundaries. It's when we kind of, for the first time, are exposed to risks outside the social home, where we, meet people that aren't necessarily in our family and totally like us. We go to parties, we travel, we start drinking or taking drugs or having sex and doing all these things that, for the first time, that are often viewed as risky. But really, these things are kind of more rites of passage in many ways. Most young people partake in these practices in one way or another. So again, here we need to think a little bit about how notions of deviance and offending and antisocial behaviour that are attached to young people, and particularly specific groups of marginalised young people, are really often just kind of, growing up, parts of growing up. But the way that different groups of young people are treated, particularly when they're more likely to perform and do these things in public space, sees them have an increasing chance of being exposed to the various disciplinary institutions, such as the law enforcement agencies and things like that. So the pushing of boundaries that young people do in this kind of youth period is often kind of seen by older period as antisocial behaviour or whatever. Ironically, it seems that people, as they get older, forget what it's like to be a young person. They probably did all this stuff themselves. And then this again relates to all this moral panic stuff about young people's lives, whether that's, binge drinking and risk taking, or, various forms of youth culture that always seem to be misunderstood and scapegoated by older people. The pushing of boundaries and the taking of risks, in this sense, I think, rather than kind of thinking about them as risk-taking or, antisocial behaviour, very much better thought of those kind of ideas of a rite of passage that all young people go through to one extent or another. So what do exactly we mean here by antisocial behaviour? This particularly relates to media representation, where young people are constantly used in news media and opinion pieces and all kinds of things, almost a kind of a spectacular form of entertainment to be denigrated. Young people are demonised and scapegoated across all these kind of different shows. And again, as I was talking about in the first part of the lecture, these moral panic and generational kind of struggles with young people tend to misrepresent their lives. There's the problem of crime stats as well, that there's much kind of representation of crime and deviance through stats, but really stats only, I suppose, represent who got busted for crime. And when it comes to young people and offending, maybe one of the reasons they appear sometimes more in the crime stats, although that's not necessarily the case a lot either, is that really they're doing a lot of things in public space and they're highly visible. And maybe as you get older, you get better at being a deviant or doing deviant acts or committing crime. When it comes to things like drugs, this is definitely a time in young people's lives general where people experiment, face peer pressure and all this kind of stuff. And there's been kind of debates about the normalisation of drugs over the past couple of decades. So something like, pot or ecstasy or these things that are done by, or tried or experimented with by, more than half of young people really. If they're all kind of doing that, how deviant are these practices? When it comes to violence, we also need to kind of think critically about this stuff, the way that kind of young people often, and particularly young men, are represented as being more violent than the kind of general population. Again, the stats might kind of show that sometimes they don't, but really we need to think about what violence means in these contexts, how it happens. Often the violence is between young people themselves in that kind of liminal period. What's even more problematic is when things about violent confrontations or whatever get kind of related to gang criminality all the time, which really isn't as big a thing in Australia, a place like Australia or anywhere really that it's made out to be. So again, we'll look at aspects of that throughout the course. So again, this stuff about antisocial behaviour, even when it is illegal and when it is deviant, we need to think about why in the context of what's going on here, rather than just kind of rendering something immoral and a problem, when many of these things are kind of things that most people are kind of exposed to or engage in at some part of their life particularly in that kind of youth socialisation period. So relating this back to kind of notions of deviance, and particularly when it comes to interventions in young people's lives, there's this kind of notion of risk that's been a really important way of thinking about young people in youth studies, and the various practices that they engage in, and the various interventions into their lives. So we can kind of see this in a few different ways. There's young people are seen as a risk to society, a threat to society, and again, I've discussed that already, ideas of moral panics. There's the notion that young people are likely to take more risks in that kind of developmental stage that I've also talked about a bit more as well, already as well. And again, that's somewhat controversial whether that's really the case. Some studies show that, like, say, a particular group of young men that are shown to do this kind of risk-taking behaviour won't necessarily do it any less when they get older. And really that it's often notions of risk and deviance are related more to class and race than really age. So the stats there, again, is something that we need to kind of critically look at. And when I say class and race, not that some groups are more likely to do these things, just that they're more likely to have to be busted and to have attention paid to them. Third, and this is what I'm going to talk about here, is the idea of young people being at risk. Again, this is in the kind of human services that many of you will be studying in this course. Again, sociology, criminology, human services, social work. There's been an increasing take-up of this kind of risk factor idea of intervening into young people's lives. And again, this is done from motivations for good, to try and help them. But it seems that, like many of these risk factors, these lists of risk factors, such as low socioeconomic background, so that's essentially being poor, using drugs and alcohol, the vast majority of young people do that. Really in a single-parent family, huge amounts of a divorce happens these days. Way more than 50% of marriages end up in divorce. Wagging school, a hell of a lot of kids do that. Poor school performance, experience parental neglect, receiving little parental supervision, having parents who are involved in crime. I mean, in terms of those risk factors there, I reckon I was about 3 or 4 of those. But I kind of turned out all right. So the point I'm trying to make here is that when these kind of risk factors become this thing on a page that people tick off and then decide whether or not to intervene in young people's lives, whether they're kind of a difficult child or whatever, it doesn't mean that if you're a difficult child, you're going to become a problem adolescent. If you're a problem adolescent, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to become some kind of criminal adult. But what we do know, and again, harking back to what Kelly had to say here about the way that experts intervene into young people's lives, these interventions certainly seem to expose people to labelling. And being labelled at risk in that sense, just like being labelled a deviant or a criminal or an offender, seem to be able to kind of maybe contribute to that self-fulfilling prophecy that sees the increased chance of young people being involved in institutions than not. So again, this is a kind of critical youth studies way of thinking about the interventions into young people's lives that I hope that can be in the back of your mind when we're looking at many of the other things throughout the course. Okay, I'll leave that section there and come back and talk about the sociology of gender.